Imagine a world where your very first memory isn't of a bedtime story or a colorful toy, but of a cold metallic pin being stabbed through your shirt to mark you as property of the state. Did you know that while American children were spending their Saturdays immersed in a universe of creative cartoons and limitless choices, Soviet children were being processed through a three-stage ideological meat grinder designed to kill the individual before they could even learn to speak their own mind? Today, we are tearing off the mask of the happy Soviet childhood to reveal the grim reality. How the US raised a generation of dreamers while the USSR manufactured a generation of obedient cogs. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button right now, and watch until the very end, because we're going to expose the secret games of the KGB, the terrifying psychological experiments conducted in Soviet kindergartens to identify and correct rebellious children before they even reach the first grade. The philosophy of childhood was the ultimate long-term investment of the Cold War, a clash between the sovereign child and the state material that determined the psychological DNA of the future. And while the United States was fostering a culture of radical self-expression where a child's imagination was treated as a sacred resource, the American 1980s were the golden age of childhood autonomy. For an American child, the world was a playground of choice, from the flavor of their cereal to the heroes they chose to emulate. A system that understood that a free adult is born from a child who is allowed to say no. Across the Iron Curtain, childhood was a period of ideological incubation, a state-managed assembly line where the primary goal was not the child's happiness, but their military patriotic utility. This fundamental difference between nurturing the self and forging the collective is why the American youth became the engine of the digital and cultural revolutions, while the Soviet youth became a silent, traumatized mass waiting for orders that never made sense. The contrast in the symbolism of belonging revealed the difference between a community of choice and a cult of mandatory loyalty. In the US, the 1980s were about voluntary subcultures, skaters, gamers, scouts, or artists, where a child's identity was something they constructed for themselves through their interests and friendships. The American path was built on personal identity. In the USSR, your identity was a state-issued uniform. From the age of 7, you were an Octoberist, at 10, a pioneer, and at 14, a Komsomol member. This wasn't a club you joined, it was a ladder of submission you were forced to climb. The red necktie wasn't a symbol of pride, it was a leash of the collective. To not wear it was to be an outcast, a traitor to the class, and a target for public shaming by your own peers. The Soviet system replaced the joy of discovery with the fear of exclusion, a difference that made the American child a confident explorer and the Soviet child a nervous conformist who learned to hide their true thoughts behind a mask of red scarf loyalty. The role of toys as tools versus toys as treasures showed the profound gap in how the two systems valued the development of the mind. In the US, the 1980s were the peak of the educational play revolution, with Lego, Transformers, and early video games designed to stimulate spatial logic, storytelling, and problem-solving. The American toy box was a laboratory of creativity, where the state had no say in what a child built. In the USSR, toys were either non-existent deficit items or dull industrial-grade plastic replicas of tanks, tractors, and soldiers. A Soviet toy wasn't designed to spark imagination. It was designed to prepare the child for the factory or the front line. While an American child was building a spaceship to the stars, a Soviet child was being taught how to assemble a toy Kalashnikov or march in formation. This militarization of play ensured that even in their private moments, the Soviet child was never free from the state's demand for discipline, a difference that turned the American playroom into a center of innovation and the Soviet nursery into a training ground for the infantry. The contrast in the question, why, and the death of curiosity revealed the intellectual fate of two generations. In the US, the The 1980s parenting and educational models encouraged children to challenge authority, to ask questions, and to develop critical thinking skills. The American child was taught that the truth is something you find, not something you are given. In the USSR, the question why was a dangerous sign of ideological immaturity. Education was a process of rote memorization and the parroting of state slogans. From the history books to the biology lessons, everything was filtered through the lens of Marxist-Leninist infallibility. To ask a question that strayed from the party line was to invite a visit from the school's political officer. This systemic stifling of the mind meant that by the time a Soviet child reached adulthood, their natural curiosity had been replaced by a cynical silence, a realization that the truth didn't matter as long as you gave the correct answer, a difference that made the American mind a dynamic engine and the Soviet mind a frozen statue. The final layer of this first part is the concept of the hero and the erasure of the individual. In the US, the 1980s heroes were outsiders, superheroes who fought for justice on their own terms, or rebels who stood up against the machine. The American child was told, "You can be the hero of your own story." In the USSR, the hero was always a martyr for the state. Children were forced to worship Pavlik Morozov, a boy who famously informed on his own father to the secret police and was killed by his family. This was the Soviet moral compass. The state is your true family, and loyalty to the party is more important than the love of your parents. By holding up a snitch as the ultimate role model, the Soviet system destroyed the foundation of trust within the family unit itself. The American child dreamed of being free. The Soviet child was taught that their highest calling was to be a tool of the regime, a difference that ensured the American spirit remained unbroken, while the Soviet soul was taught to betray its own heart for the sake of the red flag. The destruction of the individual began in the classroom, where the Soviet state implemented a system of collective responsibility that was essentially a psychological meat grinder. In the United States, the 1980s educational system was moving toward student-centered learning, where the unique talents and emotional well-being of the individual child were prioritized. The American classroom was a place of personal growth and healthy competition. In the USSR, the classroom was a unit of the state. If one child made a mistake or showed ideological weakness, the entire link or class was punished and forced to publicly condemn their friend. This public shaming was a deliberate tool used to break the bonds of friendship and replace them with a fear of the collective. While American kids were learning to lead and cooperate, Soviet kids were learning to monitor and report on each other, a difference that turned the American school into a nursery for leaders and the Soviet school into a training camp for submissive yes men who were terrified of standing out from the crowd. The contrast in the uniform versus the choice revealed the visual war for the human spirit. In the US, the 1980s were an explosion of childhood fashion, bright colors, graphic tees, and the freedom to express one's personality through what they wore to school. This visual liberty was the first lesson in self-ownership. In the USSR, every child was a gray blur. The mandatory school uniform was a stiff, uncomfortable brown dress for girls and a dark blue wool suit for boys, topped with the inescapable red necktie. This wasn't just clothing, it was a psychological straitjacket. The state wanted to ensure that when a child looked in the mirror, they didn't see a self. They saw a soldier of the proletariat. The American child was a rainbow of possibilities. The Soviet child was a monochromatic asset of the Ministry of Education, a difference that made the American spirit vibrant and the Soviet mind a dull reflection of the state's gray walls. The role of scouting versus the pioneer organization showed the difference between building character and building a cult. In the US, organizations like the Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts were voluntary, community-based groups focused on outdoor skills, individual ethics, and community service. A scout earned badges for personal mastery. In the USSR, the Young Pioneers was a mandatory state-run political machine. Instead of learning to tie knots or help the elderly out of genuine empathy, pioneers were forced to participate in political information sessions, march in military formations, and chant slogans praising the party. This theatrical loyalty was a soul-crushing routine that taught children that the appearance of devotion was more important than the reality of character. The American Scout was a citizen in training. The Soviet pioneer was a miniature political officer, a difference that ensured the American child valued honor, while the Soviet child valued obedience. The contrast in physical education and the preparation for war turned the school gym into a geopolitical front line. In the US, 1980s PE was about team sports, physical fitness, and the joy of movement: basketball, baseball, and track. It was about personal bests and the fun of the game. In the USSR, physical culture was a euphemism for pre-conscription training. Children as young as 10 were forced to practice throwing grenades, wooden replicas, donning gas masks for speed, and performing grueling military-style drills under the eyes of physical instructors who were often retired army officers. This militarization of the body prepared the Soviet child for a life of combat that the state made seem inevitable. The American child saw sports as a game. The Soviet child saw movement as a preparation for the trenches, a difference that made the American youth athletic and the Soviet youth strategically weaponized. Finally, the teacher as a mentor versus the teacher as a warden defined the intellectual authority of the two worlds. In the US, while the quality varied, the 1980s teacher was ideally a mentor who encouraged debate, curiosity, and the challenging of ideas. The American classroom was a space for the Socratic method. In the USSR, the teacher was an officer of the ideological front. Their job was to dictate the absolute truth of the party and to identify any child whose parents might be unreliable. If a child told a joke at home, the teacher would find out through innocent questions and report it to the principal. This pedagogical espionage destroyed the sanctity of the classroom, turning the person who should have been a guide into a guard. The American teacher opened doors to the world. The Soviet teacher locked the doors of the mind, a difference that ensured the American child grew up to be a creator, while the Soviet child grew up to be a survivor of the state's educational prison. The summer vacation, which should have been a time of ultimate freedom, was instead used by the Soviet state as a period of intensive ideological recalibration. In the United States, the 1980s summer camp experience was a diverse market of choices, from computer camps and space camps to traditional wilderness retreats, where children learned independence, self-reliance, and social skills away from the gaze of their parents. The American summer was a venture into autonomy. In the USSR, the Artek or Orleanok pioneer camps were gilded cages of collective indoctrination. Children were woken up by bugles, forced to march in formation to the cafeteria, and spent their days in political circles or rehearsing massive choreographed displays of loyalty to the party. This regimented leisure was designed to ensure that even during their holidays, the child never felt like an individual, but always like a cell in a larger, red-blooded organism. The American camp was about finding yourself. The Soviet camp was about losing yourself in the mass, a difference that made the American youth resilient and the Soviet youth ideologically exhausted. The contrast in The Moral Compass, Pavlik Morozov versus the superhero, revealed the chilling core of Soviet ethical training. In the US, 1980s pop culture was dominated by heroes like Superman, Spider-Man, or the Jedi, characters who fought for individual justice, protected the weak, and followed a personal code of honor. The American child was taught, protect your family, your friends, and your integrity. In the USSR, the ultimate role model was Pavlik Morozov, a 13-year-old who famously denounced his own father to the secret police for crimes against the state and was subsequently killed by his relatives. The Soviet state turned this snitch into a martyr, building statues in his honor and telling every schoolchild that their first loyalty was not to their father or mother, but to the party. This institutionalized betrayal poisoned the family unit, creating an environment where parents were afraid to speak freely in front of their own children. The American hero stood for truth and justice. The Soviet hero stood for denunciation and submission, a difference that built a foundation of trust in the West and a foundation of paranoia in the East. The role of toys in the simulation of the future showed which system was preparing its children for the 21st century. In the US, the 1980s saw the birth of the home computer revolution and complex strategy games like Dungeons & Dragons, which fostered logical thinking, resource management, and creative storytelling. The American toy was a cognitive catalyst. In the USSR, toys were often primitive, heavy, and focused on 19th century industrial concepts. While American kids were playing with programmable robots or flight simulators, Soviet kids were lucky to have a wooden tank or a metal construction set that required a hammer to assemble. This technological stagnation of play meant that the Soviet child was mentally tethered to the factory floor, while the American child was being subconsciously trained for the information age. The American toy was a bridge to the future. The Soviet toy was an anchor to the heavy metal past, a difference that ensured the US would lead the digital era while the USSR would crumble under its own mechanical weight. The contrast in Saturday morning cartoons versus the Soviet newsreel defined the visual diet of the developing mind. In the US, the 1980s Saturday morning was a ritual of color, humor, and imaginative storytelling, shows that celebrated the underdog, explored strange new worlds, and emphasized the power of the individual. The American screen was a window to wonder. In the USSR, children's television was a dry, didactic tool of the state. Cartoons like Nu Pogodi were rare gems in a desert of pioneer truth newsreels, and documentaries about the Great Patriotic War or the Heroic Harvest. This visual indoctrination turned the living room into a classroom, ensuring that even in their downtime, children were being fed a diet of state achievements and historical grievances. The American child grew up with a sense of unlimited possibility. The Soviet child grew up with a sense of historical burden, a difference that made the American spirit light and optimistic, while the Soviet soul was heavy with the gray fog of the party's past. Finally, the freedom of speech in the nursery showed where the true borders of the Cold War were drawn. In the US, children were encouraged to have opinions, to participate in family discussions, and to argue for their beliefs at the dinner table. The American home was a laboratory of democracy. In the USSR, children learned the art of doublethink before they learned long division. They knew that there was a school truth to be shouted at the pioneer meeting and a home truth to be whispered in the kitchen. This psychological bipolarity was the ultimate survival skill in a totalitarian state, but it came at a terrible price: the destruction of the child's internal integrity. The American child was a whole person. The Soviet child was a divided actor, a difference that ensured the American adult was authentic and vocal, while the Soviet adult was cynical, silent, and forever waiting for the state to tell them what to believe. The concept of abundance as education in the West versus scarcity as discipline in the East created two entirely different psychological archetypes of the future citizen. In the United States, the 1980s were the era of the kid consumer, where the sheer variety of cereals, snacks, and toys taught children the power of choice and the mechanics of the market from a young age. The American child was an active agent in a world of plenty. This fostered a sense of entitlement to a better life and the drive to achieve it. In the USSR, the deficit was a silent teacher of submission. A Soviet child learned that a banana or a quality set of felt-tip pens was not a right, but a miracle granted by the state or the blat connections of their parents. This Pedagogy of the line taught children to be grateful for the crumbs of the regime and to view any luxury as a reason for suspicion or envy. The American child was a dreamer who expected the world. The Soviet child was a beggar who was grateful for the leftovers, a difference that made the American spirit ambitious and the Soviet mind perpetually anxious about survival. The contrast in The Sanctuary of the Bedroom revealed the invasion of the state into the most private spaces of childhood. In the US, the 1980s bedroom was a fortress of individuality, covered in posters of rock stars, filled with private collections, and serving as a space where the child was the undisputed ruler of their domain. The American bedroom was a laboratory of the self. In the USSR, the concept of a child's room was a luxury most could only dream of. Most children lived in tiny, shared apartments where they slept on a folding sofa in the same room as their parents, under a wall carpet that muffled the sounds of the neighbors. This forced communalism meant that the Soviet child was never alone, never private, and always subject to the collective gaze of the family and the state. While the American child was developing a strong sense of I, the Soviet child was being dissolved into a permanent we, a difference that made the American adult a confident individualist and the Soviet adult a person who felt uncomfortable without the crowd. The role of creative expression versus ideological template showed how the two systems treated the spark of genius. In the US, the 1980s art and music programs in schools encouraged experimentation, abstraction, and the breaking of rules, reflecting a society that valued the new and the rebellious. The American art class was a space for innovation. In the USSR, creativity was strictly channeled into the template of socialist realism. A child's drawing was judged by how well it depicted a heroic soldier, a blooming factory, or a smiling Lenin. Any attempt at abstraction or Western-style expression was corrected by the teacher as a sign of bad influence. This aesthetic policing turned the artist into a craftsman of the regime, teaching the child that beauty only exists if it serves the party. The American child learned to create a world. The Soviet child learned to decorate a prison, a difference that ensured the West would win the cultural war of the 21st century. The contrast in The Family as a Shield versus The Family as a Target revealed the most sinister part of the Soviet educational machine. In the US, the 1980s family was the primary unit of protection, a place where children were sheltered from political strife and encouraged to trust their parents above all else. The American home was a buffer against the world. In the USSR, the state used the child as a Trojan horse inside the home. Teachers and pioneer leaders frequently questioned children about what their parents talked about in the kitchen, what radio stations they listened to, or if they had forbidden books. A child's innocent remark at school could lead to a parent losing their job or being visited by the KGB. This weaponization of innocence forced parents to keep secrets from their own children, destroying the bridge of trust that is the foundation of a healthy society. The American family was a bond of love. The Soviet family was a fragile alliance of shared fear, a difference that made the American social fabric strong, and the Soviet society a house of cards held together by mutual silence. Finally, the legacy of the playground showed which system built for joy and which built for endurance. In the US, the 1980s playground was a riot of color, plastic, and safety-tested fun, designed for the physical and social development of the child through play. The American playground was a place of smiles. In the USSR, the playground was a grim collection of rusted iron bars, heavy concrete pipes, and rocket slides that burned the skin in summer and froze it in winter. Often built from the leftover materials of factory construction, these playgrounds were miniature obstacle courses designed to toughen the spirit rather than delight the senses. The American child associated the outside world with play and discovery. The Soviet child associated it with cold metal and physical struggle, a difference that ensured the American adult was an optimist, while the Soviet adult was a fatalist who expected the world to be as hard and unyielding as the iron bars of their childhood. The ultimate verdict on the Cold War's battle for the next generation was delivered not in the halls of power, but in the streets of Moscow and Berlin in 1989 and 1991, when the millions of pioneers who had been trained from birth to defend the party didn't lift a single finger to save the regime. Instead, they were the first to tear down the bronze statues of their former idols and throw their red neckties into the trash. In the United States, the 1980s ended with a generation that, despite its own internal struggles, possessed the unshakable confidence of the individual, a deeply ingrained belief that their destiny was a canvas of their own making, and that the world was a place of endless technological, social, and personal frontiers. The American cult of the individual won because it respected the natural, messy, and unpredictable evolution of the human spirit, realizing that a nation's strength is the sum of its citizens' unique dreams. The Soviet ideological incubator failed because it tried to turn children into biological extensions of the state, a realization that when you try to program a human soul like a static machine, the system will eventually crash under the weight of its own internal contradictions and the natural human thirst for authenticity. The final betrayal of the Soviet childhood was the total, catastrophic lack of preparation for a world without the state's guiding hand. When the USSR vanished overnight, a generation raised to be cogs in a giant machine was suddenly thrown into the cold water of a market reality. And the result was a massive psychological catastrophe that still echoes today. The American youth, raised on a diet of competition, personal choice, and individual responsibility, walked into the 21st century as the architects of the internet, the venture capital revolution, and the global digital economy, because they had been practicing choice since they were 5 years old. The Soviet youth, raised to wait for orders, to march in formation, and to follow a plan that no longer existed, were left standing in the ruins of their schoolrooms, clutching red ties and certificates of ideological purity that were now nothing more than worthless rags of a dead empire. This was the final brutal proof that a society that treats its children like soldiers will always lose to a society that treats its children like people, proving that the most powerful weapon in the world is not a nuclear missile, but the unfettered mind of a child who is allowed to dream of something other than the state's glory. The lesson of the 1980s is that you can build a nation on the submission of the children, but you can only sustain a continuous civilization on the curiosity of the free. A state that forces its youth to march in perfect formation will eventually find itself marching directly into a historical dead end, because it has killed the very innovation needed to adapt. The American childhood remains a beacon of hope because it is a messy, colorful, loud, and free journey towards self-discovery, where the mistakes of youth are the building blocks of character. The Soviet childhood remains a ghost of a failed experiment because it tried to turn the playground into a parade ground and the nursery into a political cell, forgetting that a child's spontaneous laughter is the only true sound of a successful and healthy society. As we look at the old, grainy photos of the happy pioneers, we don't see heroes or the vanguard of the future. We see the tragic victims of a system that stole their innocence, their privacy, and their potential to build a fortress of lies that couldn't even stand for a century. The end of the Soviet Union was the moment the factory of souls finally shut down its assembly lines, and the world finally realized that socialist education was nothing more than a slow-motion, decades-long assault on the human spirit's integrity. The American miracle showed that liberty is the only teacher that truly matters, and that a parent's greatest gift to their child is not a set of state-approved slogans, but the absolute freedom for that child to grow up and disagree with everything they were taught. The Soviet machine died because it tried to treat the mind like a temple of the party, fixed in stone and dogma, while the American system thrived because it treated the mind like an open sky, vast and full of lightning. The ultimate victory of the American spirit was the global realization that a child who is allowed to ask why and what if will always be infinitely more powerful than a million-man army that is only allowed to say, "Yes, comrade." What do you think was the most damaging part of the Soviet Red childhood? Was it the forced, repetitive indoctrination in the pioneer organization, the chilling military drills in the middle of a school day, or the horrific culture of snitching that taught children to watch their own parents for signs of treason? Could you imagine a world where your favorite toys were designed by a military committee to prepare you for a trench rather than to spark your imagination? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice, your opinion, and your freedom to speak are the ultimate celebrations of the liberty that an entire generation of Soviet children was denied for 70 years. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button to help us fight historical amnesia, and share this video with those who still mistakenly believe that the Soviet school was the pinnacle of education. Your support ensures that the truth about the Cold War stays alive. See you in the next episode as we continue to tear down the final lingering myths of the socialist paradise.